Welcome to In This Body, a podcast where we dive deep into the potent power of embodiment. I'm your host, Ailey Jolie, a psychotherapist deeply passionate about living life fully from the wisdom within your very own body. The podcast In This Body is a love letter to embodiment, a podcast dedicated to asking important questions like, how does connecting to your body change your life? How does connecting to your body enhance your capacity to love more deeply and live more authentically? And how can collective embodiment alter the course of our shared world? Join me for consciously curated conversations with leading experts. Each episode is intended to support you in reconnecting to your very own body. This podcast will be available for free wherever you get your podcasts, making it easy for you to stay connected to In This Body, the podcast with me, Ailey Jolie. Welcome to today's episode of In This Body. Today we're joined by Paula Leech, a dedicated and experienced professional in the field of sex therapy and relationship counseling. Paula received her bachelor's degree in family and human development from Arizona State University and went on to earn her master's degree in marriage and family therapy at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Following her licensure in family therapy, Paula became certified by the American Association for Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists as a certified sex therapist. With over a decade of experience in private practice in Quincy, Massachusetts, Paula has worked extensively with individuals, couples, and families. During this time, she also achieved ASEX certification as a supervisor of sex therapy and co-founded a sex therapy agency and training institute. At this institute, Paula not only saw clients, but also played a pivotal role in training therapists to become competent and confident sex therapists themselves. She presents regularly at various training institutes, universities, and therapy agencies across the United States. Paula authored a book, Overcoming Anxiety in Sex and Relationships, that is set to release in October. Interestingly, Paula was one of my supervisors during my training to become a certified sex therapist with ASEX. During our time together, I really appreciated her humility, humor, and her ability to communicate really important information with insights and grace. I enjoyed learning from her and appreciated the depth of understanding she brought to the complexities of human sexuality. Paula is passionate about her work. She finds joy in guiding relationships and individuals toward greater intimacy and a thriving, evolving connection with themselves and others. She finds joy in guiding relationships and individuals toward greater intimacy and a thriving, evolving connection with themselves. Paula believes in the boundless knowledge we can gain from exploring the intricacies of people's lives and relationships and embraces an endless curiosity in the fascinating area of human life. Paula, I am thrilled to have you with us today. Welcome to In This Body, the podcast with me, Ailey Jolie. Okay, Paula, I wanted to ask you what initially drew you to the realm of therapy and sex education, if there are some particular experiences that you had in your own personal life that led you here.
Great question. Complex one. So many things, because as you can imagine, I've been asked this question lots of times, and each time something different comes up. But if I was going to try to distill it down, a couple of things. First off, my parents got divorced when I was in kindergarten, and then they remarried each other. But they remarried each other several years after spending time apart in separate states even. So I got to witness the dissolution of a marriage and a relationship, lessons learned in the time apart, and then the rebuilding or coming back together of relationship. So that was fascinating. I was also an only child and spent a lot of time just in witnessing in general. And I think that helped. I'm learning a lot about my only childdom as an adult. So one thing being that when conflict lands between me and other people, I have no tolerance for it, because I think being with a sibling, you kind of get used to conflict kind of being in the air, or not, feeling uncomfortable or not liking someone for a little bit. But for me, it's like a itchy, get this out of here. And so I've had to learn how to have conversations with people about conflict, how to extract it from a pretty young age, how to do it with my parents. And then, in terms of sexuality, there's a couple of interesting things. I mean, there's like a family history of sexual trauma that I've, sort of been in relationship with and to since I was a kid, and my parents were able to talk to me about some of these things, and I really learned a lot more about it as an intern and how it affects me. And then my own sexuality always felt like I always imagined, aliens looking down on Earth, watching us dance and fornicate and being like, what are they doing down? And it just felt like something that was disconnected from me. I didn't understand it. I felt uncomfortable with my own and with my own body. And so I think that stirred up a fascination with it. I wanted to, at least in like middle school and high school, I wanted to pretend like I was like skilled and comfortable. Like I wanted to exude that feeling, which meant that I had to learn a lot about what it was. And so I think, those things coming together created this sort of perfect storm for therapist me to come
Yeah.
forward.
I love it. I want to bring you back because I feel like it's an area that's oftentimes not spoken about. And you just like briefly named it. Though how sexual trauma can get passed down intergenerationally.
Yeah, really good question. Um, you know, uh, it when you're a kid, um, and when I was given a story about the trauma that exists in my family, it's when you're younger, you don't really understand sex and sexuality. You don't understand the implications of the story, but I felt a heaviness around it. I always felt a heaviness around it. And my parents did a fantastic job of trying to create a really sex positive environment in our home. And it felt like there was this positivity, but there was a shadow in the background, like and the positivity felt like their way of shielding me or protecting me from that, even though I still felt it. And so it went as this sort of unnamed thing until, like I referenced, my internship experience where I started working with sexuality, working closely with sexual trauma, and suddenly it kind of came to life in my body, where I found myself weeping during a session, and it completely took me by surprise, and I really did not understand why it was there. And so my supervisor sort of talked me through it, but it wasn't until my drive home that I put together that I never really felt the implications of the story. I never really let that like thing in the background, that shadow, in until that moment where it really came together. And suddenly I was grieving for my family member. I was putting together how it had an impact on me. I was really processing it. And it was a blessing, that moment, because I have since learned how to partner with that feeling to do the work rather than trying to wall it off. It's with me, and my like feelings of grief around it, my feelings of grief around my own sexual history and experience, and what some might call kind of traumatic experiences, is with me in the work, and I can partner with it, and it can be next to me, and it's invited because it gives me such useful information. But it really is this thing that, like trauma in general and sexual trauma, it affects all of the like the main things that make us human: our vulnerability, our ability to share and connect, to feel safe in our bodies and our own skin. And that has such a ripple effect. And so inevitably the reaction to that from my family members was going to be transmitted down to me. And again, the like sex positivity and the really environment was in reaction to this heaviness in the background, and I felt that, and so down it goes, right? I hope that answered your question. So like long-winded.
No, it's perfect. I'm curious if you remember how that heaviness showed up. Like it sounds like you knew the story, but oftentimes I'll talk to people and they'll have felt that heaviness. And there's this wounding around sexuality, and we'll go through their sexual history, and there isn't a specific moment. but it feels larger and more personal than something cultural, but it's
Right.
not exactly in their lived experience. So I'm curious for you if you can share, if you remember kind of what that heaviness felt like, because I do think it has a different tone. At least that's been my lived experience too, of knowing some of the family lineage and the sexual trauma that exists. It feels different in my body.
Yeah, it does. And that's a really good question. Um, it, for me, I feel like it felt different in my body because I couldn't pinpoint it.
Mm.
I couldn't say, like I look to sort of high school and college, and some of the like harder sexual experiences I had then, and I knew this feeling is connected to this, and this thing was sort of again sort of there in the background, but I couldn't ever really pin it down. It was just this, again, this sort of shadowy, um, generalized kind of feeling, that didn't stifle. Again, if anything, it added to my curiosity about sexuality, because what is this feeling, and why is it here, and is it limiting me? How is it limiting me? How is it impacting my sense of sexual freedom or curiosity or my ability to be in my body? Or is it, you know, everything that I'm taught about what it means to be in a female body, and I need to look sexy? I don't feel like a sexy person. I need to look beautiful. My role is to attract men, but I don't feel like I'm attractive. Is it that's right? So it's just this like elusive, foggy thing that I could never quite pin down, that it felt heavy. It felt a bit sad. It felt disconnective, you know.
How do you support someone when they're working with that feeling?
Well, one thing that I don't do is I'm not going to say you probably have trauma, or right. So many people have heard that. Like, I can't
Yeah.
understand this aversion that I feel, or this anxiety, or this fear that I feel, and so I must have had something horrible happen to me. Well, not necessarily. And we can cause trauma by naming, or trauma that may or may not be there. So we can talk about the intergenerational impact. Our parents didn't receive great sex education. Our parents have been disconnected from the. We live in a world where we have over time become increasingly disconnected from like our sort of animal primal nature. That's confusing to step into an experience that asks us to shed all of our conditioning and our scripts. It's confusing. And so how did our parents relay their training to us? What was that like maybe for them? And did you feel any kind of shadowy darkness? Because it can be yours from your experiences, or it can be from theirs. This stuff travels. So we can talk about the intergenerational part overtly.
I'm curious because you've named growing up in a sex positive household. What did that actually look like? Because that's very rare that I hear someone say that there is a sex positive household, and there was some stuff behind it, and it sounds like a reason why it was so amplified. But what does that mean? Even paint me a picture.
Great question. So what that looked like was, my dad was very lovely and generous, and sort of talking, making sure I felt supported during my period. Did he need me to go get tampons or pads for me? Did he, need me to get, um, for him to get me some tea, or, like he was just
Mm.
very open about that. So it wasn't just mom who I could talk to about, what was happening with my body. They also, they normalized the fact that they had a sexual life, you
Mm.
know. My parents love this story, but they used to, like, I'd be out with my friends, and my dad would call me and be like, I'll pay for y'all to go to see a movie. And I'm like, why? And he's like, just please stay out for a little while. Like, just stay out for a little while. Your mom and I are having some. So I knew that they had a sexual life. There were boundaries around it, appropriate boundaries around it, but I knew that they were sexual people. And then my mom always, from a young age, books about sex and sexuality, we were sitting down together, reading through them, despite how cringy that felt for me at different moments. She encouraged, hey, your body has pleasurable sensation. You can find it. Here's different ways. Now I'm going to leave the room. You do you. That's what it felt like. And we didn't there was humor involved too, which I think is so important, especially in adolescence when all of it feels so awkward and strange. So when we were watching television shows together, we're not quickly changing the channel when like a sex scene came on, but maybe there was some humor around it, maybe a little bit of conversation. That's what that felt like. And the wonderful thing about that too was that my friends were very aware that my parents were very open about this. And so my parents became the parents that my friends came to with their questions or difficulties. And I always loved that they could be those go-to people.
How do you feel like that's laid the foundation for your work today? Because I'm just imagining, I'm like, you are now literally the person that people go with their difficulties to and their questions to.
That's true. And I never thought about that. But it feels like it makes a lot of sense to me, the both and my confusion and the the access to conversation and watching how meaningful it was for my friends to have a go-to spot, watching how important those conversations were, watching how scared and nervous they were to talk about something or what does this mean, and then feeling the instant sort of relief that came from actually having conversation, and also watching the profound connection that happened around it. So yeah, I think it had a huge impact.
With there being a sex positive household, you named like the disconnection that inherently happens kind of in society. Did you have that moment of disconnection or disembodiment from your own sexuality, or has that been something you've maybe always been able to stay in contact to?
Moment of disconnection with my own sexuality in life? Oh, yes. I mean, there's the sex positive household, and then there's the world that we live in.
Yes.
And unfortunately, at a certain point in our development, mom and dad aren't the most important source of information and not the most impactful. And so, coming into adolescence in general, the teen years, all that you care about are your peers. That's all that matters to you. And so that's where, again, I also lived in a place that was very kind of body shamey. I think we all kind of lived in that culture for decades, like you had to look the part. Otherwise, you weren't a sexual person. You have to look this very particular way. And I never felt like I fit that. And so despite how positive my parents were, I felt disconnect because of what society was telling me about what sexuality is or means and what it means to be a sexual person. And so I felt that disconnect. I still work with that disconnect within myself, and my sexuality consequently looks a very particular way. And a lot of it is very like mine. And I'm a parent now, so I've got little kids running around. So I'm in a stage of like, where am I? Me. Where's my time? Where's my sexuality? Where does it exist? What does it look like? But it always felt hard for me to be really vulnerable and open myself up and share my body and share my sexuality when I never felt like that was for me.
Mm. I love that you've named this, because so often I do have clients who come forward and they have that sex positive kind of familial experience, and there'll be this resistance to like really looking into the culture and how that impacts sexuality, or the scripts that someone who's femme identifying just inherently kind of gets handed down. And I would love to hear from you how you feel like culture and society really squishes sexuality or creates people who are so deeply disconnected from their sexuality.
There's a million ways we've screwed it up so bad. We've made such a big mess. We've made such a big mess. I mean, if you, there's so many pieces, but like one big piece, and we even use this word, we still use this word, but performance, we still talk about our sexual performance. And if we're gonna, if we're gonna really have the kind of sexual experience that we all long for, that like really transcendent letting go experience, then we are not in performance mode. Then we're not in the mode that most of us live in the rest of our day. Who do I need to be in this context? What do I need to look like? How do I need to act? What are my rules? What are my scripts? And so if we approach sex with that mentality of like, I need to be or do, and here's my list of shoulds, and here's my role, here are the expectations attached to my role, well, then we're going to be in a cerebral place around the experience for the experience. And and depending on the gender, however you're socialized, male or female, we're all handed just like right out the gate, a really awful list of here's what you need to do to look the part, to do the part. Here's the role you're expected to take. And they're all incredibly limiting. And so we contend with that when we step in. And part of sex therapy is can you dare to be brave enough to let go of performance? Intimacy is not an audition. Can you really reveal yourself to another person? What makes that hard? What makes it hard for you to let go into what is an inherently vulnerable, expressive experience? What's your relationship like to expression in the day-to-day? What's your relationship like to your vulnerability? Do you work to like beat it back, keep it at bay? How communicative are you around your feelings or your experience in your day-to-day life? Are you a yes person? What's it like to say no? These are all the things that sex is saying, hey, I invite you in to be authentically you with your boundaries, with your wounding, with your imperfect self, and to embrace it, to approach it, and let go into it. And this is also what makes sex so profoundly healing. But that is not the concept that we're given. It needs to be sexy. It needs to be fun, fun, fun all the way through. We're meant to be wholly satisfied every second of the experience, which makes it a high stakes, high pressure event. And when we've made it really like kind of New Year's Eve experience of life, it's like, it's got to be fun. And then we're disappointed when it hands us up more life.
How do you feel that scripting really harms those in the femme experience? There's like quite a few just clients I've had over the years, or young women, or even friends that I've known a little bit myself, but this was less in my personal experience, where I had this idea that sex was supposed to be this performance and so peak and so wonderful and all those things. And my experience was so far from that that I just gave up. And I was like, well, you look like you're having a peak experience. So I guess one of us having that is better than no one. And I would love to hear you speak about that experience more, because I feel like that performance, even if that's not you and you don't reconcile that in your own experience, it's still in the room.
Oh, absolutely. Well, people socialized female are trained to attend to others, and we are trained to and both genders really, we're taught that our sexuality is about the other. That's why it's like, oh, you didn't make me come. You didn't. It's our responsibility to make sure that our partners are attended to and having a good time. And consequently, we're not encouraged to understand our own experience, our own instincts, our own intuition, tap into the wisdom of the like emotions that are surfacing for us, understand what sensation is like in our bodies and how to follow it and how to build. We're not given any of that conversation. And so then it is, I don't know how to be with me. And one thing I try to stress with all my clients is like, you are your primary partner in sex, even when you're with another person. What's it like to be profoundly in the presence of you, making love to yourself, having sex with yourself, fucking yourself, all the versions. Do you cringe at any of those ideas? Do you recoil? Because, truly, if the orgasm gap can be explained by just that. We are
Mm-hmm.
not encouraged to learn about our own bodies. And we treat the vulva especially as like this separate thing, separate from the rest of your body. And we're given awful and confusing messages about what it means to have a vulva. And then we're supposed to sort of come into this profound connection with it when we're birthing children. It's also challenging and yucky, right? But if we can help people learn how to, come into themselves and do the learning that that was never available to them, well, then we've got ourselves an experience. But it also means, again, having the bravery to share with you what my sexuality looks like, what it really looks like, and to talk to you about how to find sensation in my body and how to treat my body the way that it needs to be treated today, which means I need to know how it needs to be treated today.
Because I have this information about one modality that you support others with and also teach to other therapists, Sensate Focusing, I would love to hear from you how you use that practice, and other practices, if there are other ones, to really help people start to have that connection to pleasure or to sensation in general. I'm sure you've had this experience, but I've had so many clients who are unable to reach an orgasm or don't experience pleasure. And then I'll ask them, like, do you feel like the sweater meat button I can see is like jabbing into your body right now? And they're like, no, I have no idea what you're talking about. And I'm like, okay, that's like step one. I would love to hear how you work with someone actually come into connection with their body, because it is, in my mind, the hallmark or the foundation place of all sexual experience is connection to the body.
Right. Well, yes. I use a technique called Sensate Focus. It's been around for a long time, and it's basically mindful embodiment practice.
Mm.
And it is very slow and it is very progressive. And why does it need to be slow and progressive? Because most of us do not slow down with ourselves in the ways that Sensate Focus asks us to. And so when we like slow down and come into touch, sensation, emotion with ourselves and with another person, it brings a lot to the surface. And in sex too, it's classic. We like skip past a lot of it to get to the action so that I don't have to feel that vulnerable feeling, that feeling that, that some of us have had when we turn and we just look in the eyes of our partner, or we're saying, I love you for that vulnerable feeling, because it is associated with a lot for us, a lot of complexity and a lot of hard lessons. Some of the first lessons in what it means to be vulnerable in our families of origin. Was it safe? Was it unavailable? Was it dangerous? And so these kinds of things come to the surface, and they inform the barriers to the kind of intimacy that we want with ourselves and with other people. And so we meet them, and that can be really challenging. And so we really get to know through meeting sort of what comes up in the body, what tension shows up, what discomfort shows up, and what it's connected to. We learn about truly what sex is associated with for
Mm.
us. Oh, sex is associated with, you know, uh, vanishing, I'm not here, or discomfort, or pain, or joy, or we learn about what it's associated with. And then what Sensate Focus does is, instead of like for example, you move into a sexual experience and instantly you're anxious and you're going, what's this anxiety doing here? I love this person. I want to be with them. Well, the anxiety is likely connected to one of those associations. It likely has something to do with your brain giving you a warning, like, oh, hey, this wasn't okay for you when you were a kid. You want to go here? Or this wasn't okay for you last week. You want to go here? And so we learn to notice the warnings, and then we stay rather than trusting them. And we communicate safety to the body in the midst of them. I'm not going to resist you. You can stay. And by virtue of that, that association starts to fall away. And then we build new associations that lead for more ease in sex, which is really what I see my job being, is to help people cultivate ease, because with ease comes possibility for all of the colors of emotion that sex has for us, pleasure being one of many. All of them offer reward.
Hmm. What challenges do you often come across when kind of working at this intersection of mindful embodiment and sexuality with people?
Well, lots. Um, so if you think about one really good example that's come up recently in the work has been initiation, right?
Mm.
So like initiation is tough for a lot of folks, and so we do lots of things to cope with it. Like we'll be jokey about initiation, or we'll be like overtly aggressive, or like slow and trepid. It's hard because I'm putting myself out there and I'm inviting you into an experience. And uh and so again, we move through it quickly or we make it jokey. And so with some of my couples, they've been talking about how to do initiation differently. And as soon as we start to dig into that, it becomes how apparent how much bravery is involved in putting ourselves out there with each other and really revealing ourselves. So like, oh, instead of just like quickly taking off all our clothes and jumping into bed, can we disrobe in front of each other? Well, what might that be like? Oh, well, I mean, on one hand, it sounds really sexy, but on the other hand, I'm showing you this body that I've traveled through the world with, this body that has the world's told me is not good enough, not fill in the blank enough. I'm showing you this body that's acquired its own wounding and trauma, and then suddenly it's like, oh, this is why.
Mhm.
This is why we quickly do the thing, or we make jokes, and this is precisely what shows up in Sensate Focus is, all of the messaging, all of the lessons. And so coming back into the body again, we're greeted with those. So body dysmorphia, trauma, on and on and on, and it's itchy. And so what we'd like and what culture offers us in some ways is like a quick fix. What's the quick fix? Can you give me a diagnosis and then maybe a pill that's going to treat this thing, and then my desire is going to come online, or this will be easier for me. And so that's one of the biggest barriers is this like goal-oriented strive mindset, the like, let's get this done quick, when sex is like, wait. This isn't just about like, you having orgasm, which by the way is catharsis, like emotional, physical, psychic catharsis. But this is about, again, these realms of who you are as a human. And so we can't rush past that. Meaningful change around our sexuality requires that like meaningful work. Can you slow down enough to allow it to happen?
How do you work with that resistance? There's so many experiences that I've had clinically, but also just even personal resistance I've had for myself of like, I want my sexuality to be this way. There's that striving part. It's like, I'll go to the tantra workshop and the this, that, and the other thing. I'll get all the tools and all the skills. And but it doesn't actually shift or change. It just is that another element of performance. And I have so often in my own personal life clinically too, but also felt this like this striving. I go into it, I get more skills and tools, but there's still this like deep resistance to actually slowing down.
Right. Well, I mean, first off, I tell people, because folks often get referred, I'm sure you've encountered this, to sex therapy when they already have like a individual therapist and a couples therapist, and they're like, so you're just going to deal with the like sex part.
Totally.
Yeah. This like compartmentalized separate thing over here. Yeah.
Mhm.
And and so we talk about the, uh sex. It's really true. The saying in the field that like everything's about sex but sex, you know.
Yes.
And I'm not a Cosmo magazine. I'm not
Mhm.
here to throw a couple of different positions at you that
Mhm.
are, that may result in like the 2-week-old Band-Aid that you're trying to stick back on in terms of healing. It's like, oh, that was kind of interesting for a week. Now we're back here at this thing. Well, that's because it's not really about any of those surface level things. So with sex therapy, the sexual concern is the tippy tip of the iceberg, and then it's got all these roots, right? And so my job as the therapist is to help folks understand why, for example, if you slow down into this mindful embodiment touch, this sensate focus, and you get giggly or you get agitated, why that agitation has everything to do with your low desire, why that agitation has everything to do with your erectile dysfunction. Like my job is to help connect the dots so that you understand how all the things, all of the like difficulties that we have with our vulnerability, all your training around intimacy has everything to do with the manifestation here. And so if we want meaningful change, I have to pretend like you don't have an individual therapist. I have to pretend like your couples therapist doesn't exist, because the anxiety that you're looking at with your individual therapist, or the like avoidance or resistance that you're trying to deal with in couples therapy, has everything to do with what's happening here too. And so you can try and bypass it, but anything beyond the like excavation is vacant, and you will bump into that, you know.
This is why I love what you said, because this is why for me and how I hold it, sex therapy in my mind is like the deepest trauma, not only reprocessing, but repatterning. Because when you go into like the body and you're like, okay, I want to feel pleasure, or I want to feel ease, or I want to get out of my mind to have this sexual experience, you're going to be confronted with like this, that, and every reason from the past 40 decades as to why that's not a good idea and it's not safe. And you really do, at least what I've seen and what I've experienced, is you really have to do kind of look at all of those in one way or another so that you can come into that connection with ease and pleasure. And I really don't think that's really well, it's probably intentionally not marketed, because no one would come to sex therapy. They'd be like, this is but how do you work with that? Because I have so many clients who've come into my practice and wanted me to be a Cosmo magazine, and I'm simply just not.
Well, and um, it's so interesting. So I like to give a little window into this too, like the ways that our physiology gives us clues, again, about the ways that we've gotten sex wrong and what we're actually dealing with here, and so I like to let people know that, we've got our like sympathetic nervous system, the like fight or flight. It is our fight or flight response. It's responsible for the rapid spread of energy in the body, our stress response. And then we have the branch of the nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system, which is rest, digest, restore. So it's responsible primarily for helping us come back into homeostasis and helping us move through anything that gets in the way of us finding our center.
Mm-hmm.
And so sleep is in parasympathetic, but our sexual functions live in it too.
Oh, man.
And our sexual functions require a similar process as sleep does, AKA I'm like letting go of stressful thought from the day. I'm letting go into more sort of fantasy imagery. I'm letting go in the body. I release or surrender into sleep, or I release or surrender into arousal, orgasm. But the thing that's interesting about that, and also explains why some people have difficulty with orgasm, is if our sexual functions are here in the parasympathetic to help us find our center, well, then could our sexuality or our sexual experience be in favor of us moving through whatever gets in the way of our center, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which means that in sexual experience, we may bump into grief. We may bump into our trauma. We may bump into sorrow, big feelings, agitation, anger. We may feel inclined to hit or wail. And if we expect that to be there, then moving through those experiences in and of itself can be pleasurable. If we don't expect that, if it's supposed to be only pleasurable sensation the entire time, well, then that's an intrusion, and I'm doing something wrong, or I'm having bad sex, or there's something wrong with me.
Mm-hmm.
And right.
Yeah,
And this
I adore what you are saying, because the amount of clients that I've had who have a history of sexual trauma, and then the
right.
grief comes up and the pain comes up and the anger comes up, and then they're like, well, I guess this like isn't my person. This is a sign, or it's too hard, or I can't work with this, which is setting that expectation that this is stuff that has to move through your body.
And sometimes it means that we've created a safe enough context for it
Yeah.
to come forward. Sometimes we're sobbing in a sexual experience because for the first time, I'm safe enough to really be vulnerable with someone. And so it's part of our healing. And this is, another thing that I feel like is a big part of my job as a sex therapist is to help everyone understand how your sexuality is trying to help you. It is trying to help you, not harm you. Let me help you understand how. Can we do things differently if we'd like to? Absolutely. Are there other things to tap into? Absolutely. However, it is in favor of your ongoing sort of like, you know, sense of balance, sense of ease, connection to yourself. If we learn how to let go into sex, AKA into ourselves, into our stories of ourselves, into our authenticity, well, how will that impact my authenticity in the day-to-day? If we become proficient in understanding what our boundaries look like in sex, well, how's that going to affect my relationship to boundaries in my day-to-day? If I learn how to let go with ease, how's that affect my relationship to control in my life and in my relationships? Like it has just that just sort of ripple effect. And so it's like, oh, working with sex can lead to, yeah, more orgasms, but working with sex can also heal depression or eating disorders or addiction.
When you say that, what my mind goes to is just that very psychoanalytical concept that sexuality is life force energy, it's eros.
Mm-hmm. And I didn't understand that. I didn't connect with that idea for a really long time. It felt too woo-woo for me until you do the breakdown of what sex asks of us, the sharing, revealing, letting go, connection, expression. And then it was like, oh, okay, this makes sense that when our sexuality gets harmed, that it harms those arenas of who we are as humans. And that's profound. And then the healing around that is just so powerful, so magical. So that's when it finally clicked, because it's always been described as that. But again, me being me and disconnected from my own for so long, it was like, it's just a woo-woo idea.
I'm curious, since you have a book coming out in October, if you could tell us a little bit about that and how that book might touch on some of these topics of embodiment and sexual expression.
Yes, yes. Yeah, speaking of vulnerability, it's very scary. I have a book coming out in October, and it's basically it's called Overcoming Anxiety in Sex and Relationships, because as we've kind of referenced, often the symptom that is the most obvious to us when we're, you know, experiencing low desire, having a difficult time sexually is anxiety, is that like warning that our brain's giving us. Dr. Siggy, who's a child psychologist, talks about how the opposite of anxiety is not calm. The opposite of anxiety is trust. And I feel like such a huge part of like what sex therapy is like when I'm anxious during sex, what am I distrusting? Is it my body, my own instincts, my own sounds, expression, the other person? What are we working with? So the whole book is basically, it talks about the anatomy of anxiety, our physiology around like our sexual functioning, how they're at odds. And then the middle part of the book talks about just sort of sources of anxiety that we accumulate around our sexuality just by being human in the world that we live in. And then the third part is about more somatic kind of sensate focus experiences that can help move us into greater ease or freedom around our sexuality, which means profound contact with ourselves, which means moving through our own sort of messaging around sexuality from growing up, differentiating from some of the sexual values of our families, maybe even our religion, of our culture, and yeah, looking at the impact of that. So that's the book.
What are some of the main sources of sexual anxiety from your perspective?
Oh, good
Good
question.
question, I know.
Yeah. Well, first off, I mean, silence, you know, silence, no, a sex education that for most of us was centered around fear. I don't know about you, but my first lessons in sex in like a public, in the like educational context were like really horrifying pictures of STIs, like at
Mhm.
the, at the most extreme, and that were the first conversations. How does that impact our sexuality? That the first ideas that were given were, pregnancy can happen like that, so don't have sex. And also if you have sex, you're going to get one of these horrifying STIs that, no one will ever want to have sex with you ever again. And you're going to be a freak and it's terrible, you know? So lack of education, performance narrative, silence around sex and sexuality, no information about how to take care of ourselves sexually, no conversation around boundaries, gender socialization, of course, the religious ideology. And, I get a lot of folks who come from religious backgrounds where, things that happen to me that are bad were me, and then things that happen that are good or come from God. And there's no self-trust in that. And so how do we move into like letting go experience if I don't trust myself, right? So there's just so much, so much in this that contributes to a baseline.
How do you know if anxiety, because of the things that you've named, can be so unbelievably common and almost invisible in the world that we live in right now? How do you know if anxiety is the thing that's getting between you and the sex you want to be having?
Well, anxiety is an interesting thing too. So, and we, it's interesting because it's the only human emotion that we've given the like status of diagnosis. Like you can be diagnosed with anxiety, but we aren't diagnosed with grief or anger, which leads people to believe that it's not something that we all contend with. We all deal with anxiety. We all have to work with anxiety. But often because we aren't taught about how it works or how it operates, we deal with it in ways that aren't helpful, that actually can make it worse for us. AKA, anxiety will give us something like, say your partner cheated on you once in the past and you're trying to heal from that together. And they go out with their friends for the first time since the thing happened. Oh my gosh, I'm feeling really, really anxious. How do I respond to that anxiety? Well, I respond to it with control. I want to control. And so I'm going to text you 50 times, and then I'm going to put a tracker on your phone. And then and really that becomes just sort of like a bottomless pit because it doesn't actually address the thing. The thing is, I'm feeling insecure. I'm feeling worried and unsteady. Can I look up underneath the hood of what anxiety is showing me and understand the thing I'm actually reacting to, and then seek out what I need for myself, or with that other person from that idea, right? And that's how it shows up in sex too, where it's like we get anxious, and often our inclination is to try and control. So we can often sniff out where anxiety lives the most in the areas that we are inclined to exercise the most control,
Yeah.
right? But it can also look like fear. It can also look like low desire. It can look like aversion. It can look like all kinds of things. And when we approach it, the anxiety makes itself more present.
In the research lately that I've been in touch with, it sounds like we are having less and less sex, and more and more people are experiencing less and less desire.
Mhm.
Do you have any hypotheses as to why?
Um, well, for better, in most ways, we are talking more openly about things like consent.
Yeah.
And this is just one variable. We're talking openly about things like consent, but we're still very confused about these concepts.
Mm.
And so consequently, um, we don't know, do I need to constantly check in with my partner? Do I need to be assertive here, but this doesn't feel sexy? Or, oh gosh, is this a violation? Or, and so there's just a lot of nervousness around what consent looks like, and what it doesn't need to be enthusiastic, or can it just be informed consent? Is that enough? Oh, they're saying yes, but they seem nervous. What does that mean? So we're still very confused around that. And there have been very real consequences to that confusion. There's been very real harm in that confusion. And so, so that's just one example of one way that we're talking more openly about sex, but that is kicking up some anxiety. in addition to, again, we're still working with performance narrative, but also as like an extension of that consent conversation, we kind of culturally, we're always working to sort of like, how do we check power? How do we check power dynamics? And in couples, we can't have like a power discrepancy. It needs to be 50-50. And sex is power exchange back and forth. That's what it is. And so when we try to neutralize that, it can take a lot of the charge out of it or the fun out of it. And so then, again, we're just in our heads around it versus like, and we, always want to make a nod to the kink community, because the kink community has said, just talk about what you want, talk about what the parameters are out up front. What are my boundaries? What are my yeses, my nos, my maybes? And then we can move into the experience and let go. And we've agreed on, if I'm uncomfortable about something, I'm going to speak up around it. And here's my safe word if things get too challenging. There's all of that. The sort of safety aspect of things is negotiated up front, and then we get to let go, versus how a lot of folks are doing sex, which is, I'm moving into this experience and I don't know, and is this okay? Is this okay? And was this too much? And right. So I think there's still a lot, we still have a long ways to go in terms of how we understand how to do boundaries, how to do consent, and how we do letting go and power exchange in sex.
Yeah. Power exchange in sexuality is something that has always deeply fascinated me, how essential it is for there to maintain this erotic charge, and yet how much judgment people have towards themselves and others for having erotic charge around power play. And how do you work with someone if they are just like so in that state of judgment or power shouldn't be here? How would you explain the erotic charge that can come and does come by playing with power in a space of sexuality? Boundaries of consent are there, of course.
Well, I think one thing that is really important for folks to keep in mind that we lose sight of is that sex is a form of play, even when it's serious. Even when we're having serious sex, that sex is a form of play. It's the place that we go, and often we turn to sex to create balance in our lives. So a lot of people who are like really high power, lots of control in their day-to-day want to be really submissive in sex. And that makes a lot of sense. It helps cultivate, again, that balance in our lives. And so if we have play in mind, can we play with different power dynamics? Can it be okay for me to be more dominant and have it have no implications for how I want to be treated and the role I want to occupy in our relationship in the day-to-day?
Yeah.
Can this be the place where we can drop into different aspects of our experience, try them on, and then, but again, this is the thing we're not taught how to do, and then communicate. What was that? Like, what did you like about it? What might we tweak next time? And then also learning how to communicate in the moment. Actually, this isn't doing it for me. Can we switch it up like this? Or no, this feels like this is too much dominance for me. I'm not liking this. Can we switch this up? Which also requires that folks learn how to allow in, again, speaking of the New Year's Eve experience, some disappointment into our sexual experience. Some like, hey, I'm a little bummed I was loving that, but that's okay. You were uncomfortable with it. And that's really important. If we want our sexual lives to be approachable, we have to be able to have boundaries. But with play in mind, can we not take this so seriously? As long as we've negotiated what our boundaries look like, what safety looks like for the two of us, can we allow ourselves some freedom in this place, just like we do in our fantasy space? Our fantasy space is there to help us try on different things, play with different things, approach the unapproachable, go places we shouldn't or can't or don't want to in our day-to-day. Sex can provide that too. It is we've decided that adults aren't allowed to play, but we need to. Yeah.
How do you invite someone into viewing sexuality as play? Because when I look at how sexuality is presented, for me, it just feels so objectifying, so commodified, so performative, and so structured in one presentation that play isn't something my mind would even grasp is even there at all. It's been something I've deeply had to learn. How do you invite someone into seeing sex as play and their sexuality as a deeply embodied creative act?
Right. Well, and back to the aliens and the dancing.
Yeah.
It's weird if it isn't. It's weird if it isn't. It becomes clinical, it becomes prescribed, it becomes formulaic and routine. We're checking boxes versus, like you said, this is abstract, this is expressive. This is just for the experience sake, like play is in childhood. There's no like goal in mind that we have to do this way because this is going to fulfill my 7-year-old ego. This is going to mean that I've met a challenge. No, it's something that we do for experience sake, whatever that holds for us. Pleasure or comfort or learning or healing, whatever that means. And so again, without play, it's clinical. Without play, it's headspace experience. With play, we tap into the instinctual, the expressive, the primal elements of it, and we let go.
My last question for you. What else do you wish people knew about sexuality? And about sexuality and also about being in the body. Because when you speak about play and kind of it being weird, if you're not connecting to those instincts, if you're not in your body, kind of following those impulses and trusting them, I'm really keen to know if there's anything else that you wish people knew about their sexuality and another way they could perceive it or understand it that might lead it to be more of an embodied creative act.
Yeah, great question. I think one thing that I encourage people to understand is that most sex problems are not in fact sex problems. They're intimacy challenges. They're challenges with intimacy. And the wonderful and hard thing about sex is that it asks us to come out of hiding. It asks us not to hide. Do we dare be brave enough to show ourselves? Do we dare be brave enough to be in our authenticity with ourselves and with another person? And a lot of us understand that the key ingredient of intimacy is risk, that there's no intimacy without risk. And we do it because we understand that, yes, there's the chance that I'll be hurt in this, but there's also the possibility that I will be met with acceptance, with care, with curiosity, with enthusiasm, and how profoundly healing that is. And that's what our sexuality offers us, is that like profound connection, healing space, an opportunity to be us and just, again, without all of the armor, without all the conditioning, and to experience what that's like. And for some of us, it's the only place we do.
Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I really appreciate you and everything that you offer. You have such a easeful and inviting way of really kind of exploring the intricacies of really complicated and oftentimes like quite scary topics for people. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was just wonderful to chat with you.
If you found value in this episode, it would mean so much to me for you to share the podcast with friends, a loved one, or on your social platforms. If you have the time, please rate and review the podcast so that this podcast reaches a larger audience and can inspire more and more humans to connect to their bodies too. Thank you for being here and nurturing the relationship you have with your very own